All right, good morning. Today we will give continuation to the lectures of Professor Kellogg, and I will send all of you the record of the conference. And Freddie, thank you very much. You can start if you want. All right.
Thank you, Professor George. Good morning and welcome. This is the sixth lecture in the series of 9 lectures on the subject of democracy and social conflict, how we govern ourselves between elections. Dispute and conflict. Despite the extraordinary polarization dividing our societies in Brazil and the United States, these have a constructive role in our lives, and we must understand them better. If we do not, we risk letting the great problems of our time go unresolved. Conflict is a critical part of the process of revealing problems and getting through uncertainty about them to their final and detailed resolution. We are now deep into a state of uncertainty in which serious problems exist. Problems, they are the focus of my work and of our concern. It's imperative that we find a way to understand the role of dispute in resolving them. First, a problem must be recognized. It needs to be defined. Dispute and conflict is critical in raising the level of attention and the level of detailed understanding. I remember many years ago how the subject of environmental protection, of protecting and restoring polluted air and water, came first into public attention. Increased public awareness led to implementing steps to address it. Habitual action by industry and agriculture had to be changed, and there was great resistance. More recently, the problem of widespread sexual harassment was revealed by very public incidents, leading to identifying public figures and publicized trials, and more victims claiming sexual harassment, coming forward and saying, "Me too." They also gained publicity and increased the level of concern. As the problem was further explored and defined, it came to be known as the Me Too movement, and it created resistance and reaction that is still going on. Another problem has been the global COVID-19 pandemic. Many deaths have occurred in both the United States and Brazil, many more than were necessary or preventable. The pandemic has starkly and dramatically raised a question about how we live, how we learn, and how and what we know. The question of faith in scientific inquiry has been brought into a new bright light by the inaction and resistance to clear and persuasive evidence of how the pandemic might have been controlled and how so many hundreds of thousands of deaths might have been avoided. All 3 major problems have followed what we have called a continuum of inquiry. They began with uncertainty and gradually were exposed to searching inquiry under the glare of dispute and conflict. The problem of human pollution came into clear view after the middle of the 20th century. It has now risen in importance to a level that could barely be foreseen. The calls for action have now displaced the disputes and debates, there is no longer any question concerning why the human component in global warming occurs and how it is possible to arrest it. That judgment has been made and has led now to calls for action. Notice how the original problem of sexual harassment has become identified with a larger one. As instances have accumulated and discussion ensued. Resentment was directed at the first women complaining about sexual harassment, and it became associated with other types of resentment against other forms of complaint. About bullying as a general phenomenon, the subject of sexual preference, the treatment of gay people and more recently transgender people has become included in a mix of polarized reactions. This has led to the gathering of people on both sides, of those in favor of remedial action and those against it. Judgments are being made in the law courts, and many of those judgments are in favor of the victims of harassment. It is even more remarkable that such polarization reaches into the debates over the pandemic. Public judgment here and public opinion is reflecting very poorly on those who resisted the clear verdicts of medical science. It is only through such judgments that our civilization will survive, not just the next pandemic, but all of the challenges to nature and our natural world. Here, then, is evidence of an important aspect of dispute and social conflict that was ignored by Kenneth Arrow in his approach to preferences and the phenomenon of preference aggregation. Arrow's theory depended on a picture of society in which preferences are diverse but not in constant flux and change. As they aggregate and also modify and change with the path of conflict. Customs are also affected. The customs that Friedrich Hayek believed were stable, they too are continually being challenged by the path of new disputes. Remedial legislation has played a relatively small role in events like the Me Too movement and the reaction against it. It is hard, if not impossible, to change attitudes with legislation. Instead, investigative journalism leading to publicity gives rise to anger, resentment, and the elevation of public feeling. These have been the driving force in revealing the aggregation of new preferences. But elevated anger and outrage can easily get exaggerated and victimize people without proper cause. So the debate ensues, reaction results, and conflict grows. You can see that such disputes, like the one over sexual harassment, are played out in a public forum, not dependent on the mechanics of democracy. While they may influence the choice of political candidates, they are not resolved at the polls. Arrow was clearly wrong when he wrote in the very first paragraph of his famous 1951 treatise, Social Choice and Individual Values, that voting is the principal method for political decisions. We are governing ourselves in these matters in ways other than the ballot or through our elections and elected representatives. Public choices are taking place between elections, driven by public disputes. All of this raises the question of our freedom to define ourselves our society. Can we create, recreate, change, or control our social and physical environment, our social world? Freedom is the bellwether of democracy and democratic society, but discussion of it has historically referred to freedom from tyranny. The idea of freedom that has grounded the definition of a liberal society has been individual freedom. Far less attention has been given to social freedom, even though individual freedom is highly dependent on it. Social freedom was the subject of Roberto Mangabeira's Unger's book, False Necessity. His thesis in that book was that nothing in the literature and conditions of society and democracy stands in the way of our freedom to design or redesign our circumstances. Unger makes a powerful argument that our societies have no essential qualities that prevent them from radical change. Society, he says, is an artifact, an idea that Unger takes to the hilt, as he says. It's a provocative and challenging argument. False necessity, anti-necessarian social theory in the service of radical democracy. Unger says on page 1 of False Necessity, quote, "We can construct not just new and different social worlds, but social worlds that more fully embody and respect creative power. We can break a little farther out of the tedious, degrading rhythm of history. We can lift a little higher the burden of social division and hierarchy that weighs upon our efforts to gain practical, emotional, and cognitive access to one another." But I ask, who is the we of Unger's vision when we are sharply divided into factions? We'll discuss Unger's books more in the following lectures. But we have to get through conflict and uncertainty. We have to change habits of action and thought, which includes language and the meaning of disputed words, terms like equality and even freedom. Political equality and liberalism are governing conceptions of democracy and democratic life, and their habitual acceptance, their patterns of belief are being challenged. Socialism, too, is a word that is now in dispute. It originally referred to a condition of state control over the means of production, but has now become referring to having to do with all kinds of social welfare legislation. Just yesterday, we had the passage of the infrastructure bill in the United States. And the American historian, Heather Cox Richardson, wrote the following, and I'm quoting her. "As soon as the Democrats in the U.S. House of Representatives passed their $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, Republicans began to say that the Democrats were ushering in socialism, infrastructure. When Republicans warn of socialism, they are not talking about actual socialism, which is an economic system in which the means of production are owned by the people." I'm still quoting Richardson. "In practical terms," she says, "that means they are owned by the government, True socialism has never been popular in America, and virtually no one is talking about it here today. The best it has ever done, she says, in a national election was 1912, when labor organizer Eugene V. Debs, running for president as a socialist, won a whopping 6% of the vote, coming in behind Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, and William Howard Taft. She goes on to say, true socialism is not a real threat in America. When politicians mean, what politicians mean when they cry socialism in America today is something entirely different. It is a product of the years immediately after the Civil War, when black men first got the right to vote. Former Confederates loathed the idea of black men voting, but their opposition to black voting on racial grounds ran headlong into the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave the U.S. government the power to make sure that no state denied any man the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. With racial discrimination now prohibited, she says, elite white Southerners changed their approach. They insisted that they objected to black voting, not on racial grounds, but because black men were voting for programs that redistributed wealth from hardworking white people to black people. Poor black voters were instituting socialism in South Carolina, said one popular magazine. That's the end of my quote from Heather Cox Richardson's piece yesterday. Now, there have been two leading theories of human freedom in the liberal tradition. One derives from the ancient Roman sources, saying that persons are free if and only if they are able to act or forbear from acting at will. In contrast, the loss of liberty is for that person to be made a slave. Slavery or unfreedom is that defined as the status of dependence on the will of another person. This is the theory that English parliamentarians used to explain why royal prerogative rendered all Englishmen slaves. They were dependent on the will of the sovereign. Thomas Hobbes replaced that theory in 1651 with his book, The Leviathan. Freedom for Hobbes was more simply the absence of interference. He defined freedom as the absence of opposition or external impediments to individual motion and action. This directly rejected the earlier claim that one can be unfree even if not interfered with, so long as one finds oneself in a state of dependence on the will of a master. Subjects of a government need not be regarded as any less free, says Hobbes, by reason of subjection to the state. So then, under Hobbes, the powers of the state were defined, certainly, but we depend on it for protection from violence and death, the war of all against all. Yet, once you include the state in the concept of freedom, the relation between social freedom and individual freedom gets complicated. Where is the line between the state as a protector and the state as a parent, concerned about many aspects of our welfare? We see this today in the conservative reaction to liberal legislation and even to efforts to make vaccination mandatory. John Dewey was caught up in this very problem of finding that fine line and redefining the concept of liberalism. That term has been greatly abused in conservative rhetoric, with little regard to its origins or to the underlying values it was designed to defend. Political battles in North and South America have associated it with a distorted idea of social welfare. After claiming to provide broader access to state assistance, leaders and regimes have instead helped themselves to public funds and abused their power. The right has relentlessly undermined the claims of liberals to implement liberal reforms by accusing them of a corrupt socialism. But as I say, socialism appeared in the late 19th century and began as a radical reform of economic capitalism that favored broad control of industry and distribution of wealth. And by the end of the 1920s, John Dewey would admit that he was a socialist, for he was convinced at first that democracy required an end to private control of the means of production. But he remained skeptical of much of the theory and practice of this ideology. So he avoided using the word socialism and was careful to discriminate between liberal or democratic socialism and authoritarian, bureaucratic, or state socialism. He wrote to a labor leader that, quote, no existing brand of socialism has worked out an adequate answer to the question of how industry and finance can progressively be conducted in the widest possible human interest and not for the benefit of one class. I, he said, can be classified as a democratic socialist. If I were permitted to define socialism, I would so classify myself. My real uncertainty, he told his colleague, came from the fact that in democratic socialism, democratic should apply to socialism when attained not merely to the method of obtaining it, and the weak point in socialism as an ism is a lack of definiteness on that point. Dewey wondered about the commitment to democracy of those who called themselves democratic socialists. What is democratic socialism, Dewey said. I read considerable talk about the democratic as applying to the process of getting socialism, but damn little about it as an adjective applying to socialism once you get it. He meant it as a more inclusive end of democracy as a way of life. His greatest concern was that socialists would lose touch with the values of liberalism, which remained essential to a democratic politics. His argument took the form of an effort to revitalize and reconstruct the Anglo-American liberal tradition. Dewey never gained much adherence to his political arguments. Ultimately, his focus on common problems got lost in the confusion over individual and social freedom. This explains much of the current lack of enthusiasm for Dewey's more important ideas, like bringing the empirical naturalism of natural science to the theory of ethics. Here lies his more important legacy. It shows how the very subject of conflict takes us further than just the world of elections and political theory. It takes us into the fundamentals of moral philosophy. Those fundamentals were criticized by both Dewey and Alasdair MacIntyre, who claimed that ethics is unmoored from experience. Conflict is the essence of experience. The disputes of today over climate and equity are not presented within the terminology of moral philosophy. there is little talk of moral theory or the balance of good versus bad consequences. There is no agreement on philosophy, but rather a demand to change ingrained habits. The great problems of today are rooted in habits, habits that resist change. One is the problem of bullying of the weak by the strong, the powerless by the powerful, that extends from school to cultural politics. And another is preservation of the planet on which we depend for life. Bullying is driven by habits of thinking and acting regarding the proper roles of women, the ranking of groups according to their race or origin or sexual preference. Climate change is now clearly driven by habits of energy use, transportation, agriculture, and commerce, and habits of thinking. The climate activist Greta Thunberg has been saying, enough talk, it's time for action. The young woman from India, Vinisha Umashankar, who recently addressed the heads of state and government delegations in Glasgow, said, I'm not just a girl from India, I'm a girl from Earth, and I'm proud to be so. She said, the time for talking is past, the time for doing has come. The youth movement has begun to transform the public dimension of attitudes toward climate change. There are many reasons to be angry, she said, among young people, but there is no time for anger. The discussion of utilitarianism last week was somewhat technical and perhaps hard to follow for some people, but an important aspect of our discussion is the underlying ethical theories and habits of belief, the issues that both Dewey and McIntyre addressed. We need to understand the lost world of moral philosophy and Dewey's idea of empirical naturalism in ethics. If conflict is the key factor in defining and opening up problems, is it working? How should it work? Dewey advanced what he called empirical naturalism, a science of morals, looking forward. McIntyre made an extended historical criticism, looking backward. A devastating critique showing where moral theory had got detached from reality after the European Enlightenment, what he called the lost world of ethics. Another writer, a professor of religion at Princeton University named Jeffrey Stout, focuses on the present and the problem of moral diversity. His book, Ethics After Babel, is about moral and ethical pluralism. Babel is the famous tower in the Bible where many voices are drowning each other out. This word pluralism often signifies acceptance of multiple viewpoints. You hear it in the conversations about political divisions. It pervades discussions of moral theory and public education. Pluralism is often identified as the cause of our polarization. But if pluralism is seen instead as what we defined as social uncertainty, the topic is radically changed. Then, the question becomes, can the notion of a permanent pluralism be reinterpreted as a condition of inquiry? The polarizing debate over pluralism does not get resolved in the abstract or as an abstraction. It gets resolved only in specific problems. Resolution of pluralism would not be a result of conversation and debate, but rather the result of action. Professor Stout calls pluralism a lack of confidence. It derives from a broad experience of unresolved problems, large and small. But imagine what would happen if problems were in resolution. What if scientists and politicians were solving the climate crisis? What then would be the state of opinion on pluralism? Or if many other major problems were being addressed, like health care, elder care, homelessness, pockets of poverty, poor public education, access to higher education? Or what if there was just a sense of commitment to getting them resolved and a sense of momentum, movement in the right direction, action? People blame liberal professors and academics for defending pluralism. Some say even for creating it. With movement on problems, academic recognition of pluralism would still be alive, but practical opinion would be less alarmed. We may never arrive at complete success, but if there is a sense that we are moving in the right direction, at some point concern with problems overrides lack of trust and confidence. This is part of what Dewey was driving at in his critique of moral thinking. It suggests that the great polarization is actually related not so much to the multitude of voices and opinions, to the Tower of Babel, but to the actual problems themselves. Conflict is not mere disagreement. It's the clash of habits with new reality and requires new habits. Lack of confidence grows out of social uncertainty. And this is why it is so important to understand how problems get identified and eventually resolved. Are plural moral languages related to problems? They grow out of habits and practices. So just analyzing the problem of Babel as inconsistent languages doesn't do much. Solving the problems does. Moral and ethical thought needs to be a dynamic system of knowledge, not a static one. Understanding conflict requires understanding our ethical roots, our moral foundations, and in these lectures, our moral dynamics, the element that is ignored by analytical moral theory. Since the European Enlightenment, there has been an effort by philosophy to establish a secular foundation for morality. It has three main paths. Utilitarianism was one of three avenues, and the other two leading ones are the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, focusing on rational principle, and third, the idea of a social contract between citizens and their government, which comes mainly from Thomas Hobbes. We focused last week on utilitarianism, but all three secular systems tend to ignore the dynamic element running through conflict. These are connected with larger habits of thought, philosophical habits. Both Dewey and MacIntyre said that moral philosophy has lost its connection with the actual world. Both recognized that practice and habit are keeping it from change. So, yes, by understanding Dewey's continuum, we reinforce the habit of solving problems. And by comparing it to contemporary theory, we understand it better. To a large extent, we govern ourselves through our moral beliefs. We sense that they operate all the time and that they can override the rational element, such as the calculus that Arrow used to prove impossibility, or the rational constructivism that Hayek mistrusted. He saw legislation as rational, but legislation does not ignore the moral world. It grows out of it. Morals and ethics underlie the system of preferences that Arrow assumed and of customs that Hayek said dominate society. They dominate human habit. Last week we investigated utilitarianism, or consequentialism, as it is now often called. It is still present in conventional moral and political theory. It is a dominant influence. How does it work? It says that the consequences of an act are all that is important. Because every act has consequences that are subject to moral evaluation, should that imply that every act has an ethical component? Washing the dishes, even playing a game, even playing solitaire? There are many debates about evaluation or measurement. If it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people, then what kind of happiness? Eating ice cream or reading War and Peace? John Stuart Mill raised this question and insisted on a higher ranking for higher or truer happiness. But how are we to know? What would a utilitarian say about the great problems of our time, like climate change, or about taking sides? How do we know if one side is better than the other, especially if both sides might be contributing to some kind of solution? It might be that surely climate change is bad enough that it should be addressed with immediate steps, such as ending the use of fossil fuels immediately. But an energy producer would say that the balance of good and bad would require continuing for some period of time to utilize fossil fuels, or the economy and people's lives will suffer. Then we get into a dispute about what rules to put in place, balancing long-term consequences and short-term consequences. But the problem itself is constantly being redefined. Environmental protection began as a problem of polluted air and water. Then it became one of global warming. At each stage, there have been two sides to the assessment of the balance of good and bad. At each stage, there has been an area of uncertainty that will not yield to an immediate calculus. There is another deep problem with the very idea of a utilitarian balance. It is a problem with the very nature of rules and exceptions to rules. Utilitarians acknowledge that utility may be disputed, but ultimately they assume that conflicts can be resolved through that calculus, originally an accounting of aggregate pleasure and pain, or good versus bad consequences. But this very calculation would say that a judge can sentence an innocent man to death if it would stop a crime wave. The loss of one life would be outweighed by the stopping of crime. This perverse result has supported the idea that rules are part of utilitarianism, or rule utilitarianism. You include the rules as adding to the good instead of the bad. This led to a division among utilitarians between act utilitarians and rule utilitarians. Both sides try to defend the very idea of consequentialism in moral theory. But here they have run into another deep problem with what we discussed last week as the problem of extensionalism. Extensionalism says that both of these views, act and rule utilitarianism, amount to the same result because of the fact that there are always exceptions to any rule. Utilitarians say it is obvious that there is an exception to every rule. Actually, there are many exceptions, as you can see from rules like don't lie or don't steal. An exception to the rule don't lie could be when a potential murderer asks you if you know the location of a prospective victim. So we amend the rule for that exception. And then there's another one, and another one. There are obvious utilitarian exceptions to rules like don't steal. They say for every situation where compliance with some rule would not produce the greatest expected good, rule consequentialism is driven to favor instead compliance with some amended rule. It doesn't want to miss producing the greatest expected good in every case at hand. But if rule consequentialism operates this way, then in practice, it will end up requiring the very same acts that act consequentialism requires. So it doesn't provide any support for rules at all. So then, why rules? This leads to trouble for the very idea of utilitarianism as a moral balance. Pragmatism says the exceptions to a rule are not and cannot be known in advance. They often lie in the space I have defined as social uncertainty. Pragmatism supports rules much more strongly than utilitarianism as the results of resolving problems and conflicts. Resolving conflicts through Dewey's transformation of reasons differs greatly from classical utilitarianism. Understanding the extensionalist challenge reveals its weakness when compared to pragmatism. Society does not always work out conflict through a legislative calculus imposed by a hypothetical utilitarian measurement, but often rather by redefining or replacing the terms and forms of calculation in disputed, problematic contexts. How does civilization survive constant conflict? It requires the retirement of incommensurable or inconsistent reasons, not the forcing of choices among them. This is precisely what Kenneth Arrow failed to recognize in his general possibility theorem of 1951. Consequentialism is the idea that you can know the outcome of a given act. It tends to ignore the role of problems in society. There are problems that don't come into view until later, like climate change. The idea of omniscient measurement has always been problematic from the lack of anything like a purely speculative omniscient measurer. Can you balance the aggregate amount of pleasure and pain of any present act? It's an ideal theory. Yet actual normative life is replete with constant changing standards of measurement. We have approached this through another distinction: utilitarianism as a form of synchronic moral analysis, immediate moral analysis, and pragmatism as the study of convergent change and adaptation, of diachronic or extended inquiry. Analytical normative theory assumes a static conceptual universe for the purpose of utility analysis. Pragmatism, rather than applying an instantaneous consequentialism, assumes that analysis of any difficult moral question can be influenced by its relative position or stage in the discovery and completion of a broader and more general question. In other words, inquiry into the specific ethical question, which I signified last week as the small letter Q, what is right in this case to do now often comes within an extended continuum, a capital letter Q, representing inquiry into what will be viewed as right after exploration of the more general questions. So you note that the individual Q, the small letter Q, may be early or late in the larger and longer extended societal inquiry of a capitalized Q. And this opens up the experience base of ethical decisions, comparable to the way in which scientific inquiry demands a comprehensive and relevant basis in experience. MacIntyre illustrated the everyday aspect of conflict in conversation that occur when a group of individuals inquire together about how it would be best for them to act so that some good can be achieved or some evil avoided. The good of this or that household or neighborhood, this or that workplace or school or clinic, this or that orchestra or laboratory or chess club or football club. The central aim of this type of conversation, he says, is to arrive at a large measure, the largest measure possible of agreement that will issue in effective practical decision-making. Such conversations, he says, are a feature of any flourishing form of everyday social life. They are all characteristically and not surprisingly scenes of conflict. Conflict is therefore as integral to the life of such groups as conversation. Disagreement makes groups focus on the important things in their lives. Silence would not do this, or avoidance. The problems would fester, and the group would lose continuity and community. Not that problems don't get ignored or fester. This is our situation now, a challenge to old embedded habits. Problems emerge and become identified in the local context. The problem is not just a verbal one, dealing with whether this action or object is better or worse, though that does require dispute to reveal. It also involves conduct and belief and the stuff of habit. As I said last week, when a particular small question, small q, first arrives, the full nature of the extended question remains yet unspecified. An example I gave is assisted death, which began as a standoff between suicide and homicide. Dr. Jack Kevorkian sought to raise a broader question and jumpstart a continual inquiry by devising a device for minimal medical assistance accessing mortal choice to a severely ill patient, for which he was prosecuted and imprisoned in 1999. His case was thus an early small letter q. This opened the problem to new experience. A generation later, after extended social inquiry into many instances of what is now the complex and painful question of assisted death, forced open by Kevorkian, the larger issue, the capital letter Q, has acquired a new utility analysis on both sides. Suicide and homicide no longer dominate the conversation. A specific inquiry today will take place within a transformed reasons environment. Earlier reasons regarding expected utility have been retired and replaced. This is also true for environmental protection. The concern began with the experience of poisoned riverways and atmosphere. It led to clean air and water legislation. But further experience of rising temperatures added perspective to the problem. Carbon and methane became the subject of study, and then the circulation of higher temperatures and their effect on global temperatures. More perspective was added by study of ancient fossils and the evidence of past global temperatures, with the possibility of a massive turning point. So, any original question or particular question during the extended period is an inquiry within an inquiry, a point that is critical to understanding social inductivism and its bearing on utilitarian theory. The analysis for a larger question will be different from the earlier reasons and the early analysis of the smaller question. Utility itself is in constant dispute. The classic utilitarian calculates the balance of good and bad consequences to resolve a dispute, but it ignores the realities of real social conflict. For the young Justice Holmes, the veteran of the Civil War, resolution was fundamentally precarious and required a new logic of contingency and experiment. He drew clues to those insights from the details of legal history, which served him as an empirical context for understanding normative inquiry, moral inquiry. How does a practice emerge amidst conflict? And how is it affected by further conflict? So we took a simple example that Holmes mentions in 1873, the emergence of the English rules of the road. Holmes observed that the rules of the road are practices that have been worked out after a sufficient amount of fighting. This suggests that we might imagine how that happened. Let's imagine a dispute over vehicle collisions for which at first there is no settled rule. We can see from the extensionalism problem that utilitarianism is a purely analytical model of rules, but pragmatism's model is dynamic and extended in time. So to illustrate that, I imagined a vehicle accident in an early traffic circle. Assuming there was absolutely no accepted driver conduct. I imagined a driver whom I named Mrs. Quickly, in a hurry and entering the circle without yielding to cars already there. There's a crash with a truck already in the circle. And because there is no rule, Miss Quickly can bring up everything in the utilitarian calculus favorable to her case, including her being late to church, the fact that the other vehicle, the truck, was carrying a cargo of scandalous literature, anything to sway the judge or jury, or anything in the utilitarian balance, the enormous balance of all the possible good and all the possible evil. And the other driver, the driver of the truck, can raise countervailing arguments such as his need for income and his duty as a professional driver to advance the interests of commerce. All such arguments are part of the utilitarian calculus. This sounds odd, but nevertheless, it serves to illustrate how rules actually come into being. In the earlier novel case, the list of properties relevant to the utilitarian calculus is as long as you can imagine it. There are aggravating and mitigating factors everywhere you look on both sides. Holmes's point in 1873 is that rules begin to be formed from within an environment of yet unregulated disputes. Once a remedial practice and then a reinforcing rule establishes a presumptive right of way for any vehicle already in the roundabout, none of the earlier drivers' reasons will be relevant. They will have been progressively overruled as the general issue is judicially explored and resolved. So generalism in law is a product of establishing a commitment to finite expectations in a given problematic situation. It often occurs at a later stage of inquiry, if and when the relevant properties can be winnowed down to a formula. You can see that the rule of the traffic circle can have exceptions, such as vehicle from the fire department that comes into the circle and there's a crash because the vehicle is not displaying lights or siren. But then adaptation is made and the rule is amended and is given the exception that when a fire vehicle comes into the circle with blinking lights and sirens, that it has a right of way over the vehicles already in the circle. That's an exception to the rule of yielding to the traffic circle. But you remember the extensionalist challenge said all of those exceptions can presumably be known in advance. They are not known in advance. So the idea of utilitarian measurement, it's the essence of this consequentialist tradition. It's fine. Utility measurement should and does indeed take place. But the challenge is understanding how. The context of calculation, the environment of normative reasons, is not static. And along with transformation of normative practice comes transformation of meanings, defining expected utility. Opposing views or expectations of utility, they're not reconciled by constant tallying and balancing or arguments, but by and through adaptation with the adjustment of habits and practices. Habit change is obviously a key issue and will be the subject of my next lectures, but it comes with conflict. The conflict must address the reality of the problem. Thus, the problem itself must be recognized, opened up. And I think that's what Miko Kawakami does in her novel Heaven, with its focus on both bullying and relativism. There is a new kind of moral challenge that she depicts, the challenge of bringing real problems to the forefront. Extensionalism involves the idea of rules. Lawyers are used to seeing them in writing as sets of sentences, as propositions. But writing or putting rules into sentences, which we might call predication, is the last step. We have examined how Dewey's continuum of pragmatic inquiry works in revealing larger problems. It activates smaller disputes, the small letter Q and the large capital Q. This gives us a better sense of the pragmatist vision of what we call the dappled world of moral knowledge that Nancy Cartwright said was true of natural science. Areas of stability and areas of uncertainty, constantly being affected by experience. But how is that experience brought into and examined and affecting the outcome of the later rule? How do rules become final and get into writing? This involves the problem of generalism, and in order to understand it, we also have to look at its opposite, or particularism. So there are many strands to my subject. The subject of dispute resolution, self-government, individual freedom, social freedom, polarization, preference adaptation, habit change, the future of society and the planet. But next week, I will address the ancient debate over generalism and particularism, which we have already begun to explore through utilitarianism. Can we understand ethics as a set of general principles? Or must we depend on particular facts and reasons? Ask yourself, do you act from general rules or particular interests? How do you act ethically? There is an enormous literature on this. And to understand pragmatism fully, it's necessary to dig into it. So next week, we'll start on the ancient question of generalism and particularism. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in a week.